Okay, so next I'm going to be talking about the ecosystem. Yeah, it's called the ecosystem. So there are a few terms that you need to know before you delve more into the topic. The first one is obviously habitat. So it is like where an organism lives, its natural surrounding. And then a species is similar as organisms that are able to interbreed. I mentioned this in the last chapter. Species will be able to breed and produce offspring. They can reproduce. A population is a group of organisms of the same species which live in the same habitat. So, like for example, the Malaysian population is consisted of people who live in Malaysia. They live in, so our habitat is Malaysia, and then there is a community. So a community is populations of all organisms from different species living in the same habitat whilst interacting with each other. So like for example, like in Kekela, I say, we have like multiple communities from multiple races, I guess you can say. And for like in like the coral reefs, maybe the fishes will interact with the corals. Maybe they use the corals as cover. All of these interactions form a community, and then an ecosystem is a few communities together in a habitat, and then they interact with each other, and it also includes non-living factors like how much water there is, what is the solubility of the soil, is there enough air, how high is it, and so on. And a niche is basically the role of the organism in the ecosystem. So for ecological niche, it will be what is its role in the surroundings, like what is its role in the habitat. And then for species niche, it is how does the species interact with the components, biotic and abiotic. So what are biotic and abiotic components? For biotic components, it's more towards living things, and it is towards living things. So there are producers, consumers, and decomposers. While abiotic components are more towards the earth itself. So the first one is going to be pH value. I mean, there are other values mentioned in the UEC book for the SPM one. Then the first one is pH value. So it is the pH value of soil. It influences whether organisms can live in that soil or not. Because most organisms like living in more neutral soil. But oh my god, my brother's probably watching weird things. Organisms live usually like neutral soil, like pH 7, but some like the archaebacteria, they like acidic soil. But then if the soil is too acidic, then only they will live. No one else will live in that soil. So yeah, the reason why is because here, a little change in pH value disrupts the activities of microorganisms that live in the soil and reduces its fertility. So even a little bit of change in the pH value will influence how that thing lives. It will like think of it as if you're in acidic water, you will feel uncomfortable in that water, right? So yeah, that's just how you should think when applying this to other organisms as well. They don't feel as comfortable in other pH of soil. Next is temperature. So temperature, obviously, like winter or summer or in Malaysia, the equator, it's always going to be constantly hot. So surrounding temperature affects the physiological activities of plants and animals. And a little change in temperature causes a reduction in the metabolic rate of organisms, as all the enzymes that catalyze physiological responses are sensitive towards temperature changes. So what that means is, if you remember correctly in the last chapter, we actually learned, not last chapter, like we learned before, that if the value of the enzyme is too high, like the temperature of the enzyme is too high, it will cause the enzyme to denature. Or if it's too cold, then the enzyme wouldn't function as well. So that's why some animals can only survive in moderate temperatures, while others can survive in hot temperatures if they have like the adaptations to it. Next will be light intensity. So light intensity and duration of sunlight received by a certain region can strongly influence the distribution of organisms, especially for plants that carry out photosynthesis. So there is two types of like light intensity. Number one is like whether the light actually reaches the area, and number two, within the area itself. So for example, in a coniferous forest, they don't really have that much sunlight towards them. While if you're in Malaysia, like in the rainforest, usually there are a lot of sunlight being shown towards the forest itself. However, in that forest, there are some tall trees and there are some small trees. or some small plants. So when you have these tall and small plants together, the tall plants will actually block the sunlight from reaching the short plants. So only some short plants can survive here. For example, so we call that tall plants blocking, that is called the canopy layer. So the canopy layer actually blocks the sunlight from reaching some plants. So that's why only a few small plants can survive there. Next will be about topography. So topography is basically the physical characteristics, like how is the Earth's surface and where is the Earth, where is that surface at. For example, how high is the surface? So that's called altitude. How high is it from the Earth? For example, like in mountains, when you're at a high altitude, usually there is less oxygen content, and it's usually less humid because most of the water vapor will be on the lower parts of Earth. So because of this, some trees will not be able to adapt, and usually they are shorter. So pine trees are quite short when you see them like on the mountains. Another type of topography factor would be gradient. So gradient is basically how steep the mountain is. So if a mountain is very steep, it is easy to be defeated by gravity. Like if you were to grow here, would you be able to balance yourself here? Not all plants could. If they were like this, the plant will definitely fall down, right? So only small plants will be able to survive on these steeper mountains. And lastly will be aspect. So aspect is basically where the wind blows and whether it will receive sunlight or not. Like for example, if I were to shine a light on a mountain slope, if I were to compare like the east coast and the west coast, if I were to have a mountain slope, and then I have this region with sea, and this region with land. So the wind will blow in this direction, but it will be blocked. But then the mountain will block this part, so there'll be less. Wind and rainfall here. So most of the rainfall will be in this part instead of this part. So that's why the part facing the sea is usually denser with plants, while the back part is less dense. I hope it's understandable. Next will be microclimate. So microclimate is basically the climate in small areas. Like for example, these rocks. Under the rocks, these small living things will have their own microclimate. Or maybe a good example would be what would be a good example? Oh, it says here, beneath the shades of the bigger plants of the forest canopy, right here. So like in the canopy where it's blocked, where the big plants, big trees block the small plants, they have their own climate. Like at the top of the canopy, it'll be quite hot, it'll be less humid, and you will have you will have low ATM. But in like the lower parts, it'll be very humid. It won't be that hot, and there'll be more ATM. ATM means atmospheric pressure, by the way. It is called ATM. If I remember correctly, lah. And then yeah, it also depends on the ability of soil to retain water around an area in order to maintain humidity. So it's basically humidity, lah. Like not all areas have equal humidity. Like at the ground, maybe it'll be easy to trap air, water vapor, but at the sky where most trees grow, it's harder. And then yeah, next factor is air humidity. So usually plants love water, so they prefer to live at places with high humidity. They also like those places because they wouldn't lose water as fast. Because if there is low humidity, if the air is not humid enough, the plants will lose water through transpiration. So yeah, if they aren't able to adapt, they will die. That's why they prefer more humid areas. Next is autotrophic and heterotrophic nutrition. So autotrophic means you make your own food. Heterotrophic means you must get food from other people or other organisms. So for autotrophic, there are two examples. I'll mention chemoautotrophic first because that's the less common one. So it is like when the organism can make its own food without light. It doesn't need light. And what it does is it oxidizes inorganic substances such as hydrogen sulfide and ammonia. So the process is called chemosynthesis. I'm just reading this thing out. So yeah, the main part you have to know is it is the oxidation of inorganic substances. Like even when we talk about photoautotrophism, we know that we're talking about photosynthesis. And we know that it involves glucose. Glucose is an organic compound. So for photoautotrophism, the organism synthesizes complex organic compounds. But with chemoautotrophism, they oxidize inorganic compounds. This one produces organic compounds, this one oxidizes inorganic compounds. And the other one is obvious light, no light. So that's that. Next is heterotrophic. So I'll talk about Holozoic first. Holozoic is like us humans. We eat solids. We eat solid organic substances. We eat stuff and then we digest them. So like human beings are. And then another one would be parasitic. I mentioned this in the last chapter where they find a host and then they absorb nutrients from the host and they will harm the host while they get the benefits. So for example, fleas and tapeworms. Imagine having a tapeworm in your intestines. That's kind of disgusting. And next will be Sepotrophism. So Sepotrops are like mushroom or decomposers basically lah. They are decomposers. They gain the nutrients from dead and decaying substances. So yeah, what they do is they excrete enzymes to digest the dead body first, and then it will break down into simpler chemical compounds containing C, H, O, and N. And then after that, they will absorb these materials in their simpler form. Okay, next is how about biotic components? We talked about abiotic components, and then we talked about nutrition. So how about biotic components? So there are three types: producers, consumers, and decomposers. So it all starts with the sun. The producers generate their food through the sun, because chemoautotrophs are usually those small organisms that do not do much. But green plants, they are multicellular and they undergo photosynthesis. So that's why all of these components usually start with plants as the producer. So So okay. So basically, when they ask you where does the energy come from, you don't say it comes from the plant. You say it comes from the sun. You say it comes from sunlight or light energy. And yeah, remember that. Do not say it comes from the plant. It comes from the sun. And then after that, the consumers will eat it. So there are a lot of consumers, but usually it goes all the way to tertiary consumers before it gets too hard to survive. So that's consumers. Consumers are basically things that feed on these producers, or if you're secondary and tertiary, they feed on other consumers. And last one is decomposers. It's basically the saprophytes where they decompose free substances and then are decaying organisms into simpler compounds, simpler organic substances. Next will be energy flow in the food chain. So in the food chain, as I said earlier, it always starts with the plant. But you must remember, do not say that energy comes from the plant. Energy comes from the sun, but the food chain starts from the plant. And then, so that will be the first trophic level. And then the second trophic level, it will be your primary consumer. And then your third trophic level will be your secondary. And your fourth trophic level will be your tertiary. So, yeah. But in a normal ecosystem, there are multiple food chains together. Like, there are some omnivores which eat both plants and animals. And there are some animals that eat more than one animal. So because of this, you cannot really have a simple food chain like this. It's always going to be connected to each other in some weird way. So we call this a food web. So in a food web, it shows multiple relationships. It consists of several food chains, and they all rely on each other. So even if you kill one of them, it will affect the whole food web. But again, it always has to start with the producers. Okay, next will be the ecological pyramids. So there are three types of ecological pyramids that we learn about: numbers, biomass, and energy. So I'll talk about this part first, where usually when you talk about pyramid, you talk about this thing, but sometimes it can be like this, sometimes it can be like this. But usually when they ask us to draw a pyramid, we just draw this one. So yeah, for biomass and numbers, they can be either of these, but usually it's this. But for energy, it always has to be a triangle, and I'll mention a pyramid, and I'll mention why later. So now, what is a pyramid of numbers? The pyramid of numbers is based on population. So again, it's based on population, and the first trophic level, okay, it's based on population, and usually the producers have the most population, but then it slowly becomes lesser and lesser and lesser. Like for example, there are a lot of trees, and there are a lot of these grasshoppers, but then there are only some birds, and then only a snake. Basically this example lah. So the higher you go in the pyramid, the lesser there will be. But as I said earlier, there are certain scenarios where this pyramid can be flipped. However, that is quite unsustainable, and it will eventually go back to its pyramid shape. So yeah, next is pyramid of biomass. So pyramid of biomass is also similar, but it is more towards using dry mass. So dry mass in this case will be like your weight. You don't call it weight, you call it biomass. So yeah, and it will calculate the total weight per unit area. So the total biomass per unit area. Like for example, in a certain amount of land, there is a very heavy amount of plants. There is a quite heavy amount of mice. There is only like a few snakes, but they're quite heavy. But it results in a large biomass, and there are like, even though like eagles are quite big, they have a small biomass because it's not many by eagles. Remember, it's not about a single organism; it's about multiple organisms in a certain area. The last one will be the pyramid of energy, and this one is the one that can only be an actual pyramid. So it demonstrates the energy transfer from one trophic level to another. For this one, it demonstrates it shows the number of organisms per every trophic level. For the biomass, it shows the total biomass per unit area of every organism. And for this one, it shows the total energy that is present in an ecosystem, and it shows the energy flow from one organism to another. So there's something called the 10% law, where if you eat a bunny, not a bunny, if you consume something, you only obtain 10% of the energy. The other energy is secreted through waste, or it can also be secreted through respiration. So not all of the energy not all of the energy from that organism will be received by you. You will only receive 10%, or roughly 10% of it. So if for example the producers ate one, if you ate like 1,000 joule of plants, the rabbit will only obtain 100 joule of energy. And if the snake eats the rabbit, it will only obtain 10 joule from the plant itself. And then the eagle only obtains 1 joule. So if this plant has 1,000 joule, and then the rabbit eats the plant, and the snake eats the rabbit, and the eagle eats the snake, the eagle will only receive 1 joule from this plant. So that's basically what the law says. It's not it's not like it only receives 1 joule when every time it eats. It receives 1 joule from the plant itself. So if this rabbit eats the plant, it gets 100 joule. But if this eagle eats the snake, that eats the rabbit, that eats the plant, it will only receive 1 joule from that plant. So I hope it's understandable lah. Next is types of interactions. We talked about symbiosis already, where it's like two different species interact with each other. So we talked about parasitism already, where one gets benefit and the other one doesn't get benefit. So an example would be tapeworm and the intestines of a human being. Another example would be commensalism, where when one gets benefits and the other doesn't. So for example, the most popular one being the shark and remora fish. So the remora fish gets to remove some extra scraps from the shark. Like the shark doesn't have to be clean because it doesn't care, but the remora gets to eat from it, and the shark will not eat the remora. So it's commensalism. And then mutualism is when both get benefits. Like for example, when the buffalo has a lot of lice on its body, the myna, if the myna eats the lice, it will, if the myna eats the lice, it will get its food. So it gets food from the lice, and the buffalo will no longer have lice on its body. So the buffalo gets a benefit because of no more lice, and the myna gets benefit because it got food from the buffalo. So yeah, that's mutualism lah. Both receive benefits. And then the other two which are newly mentioned are predation, competition, or other three, and Sepotropism. I don't have to repeat this again now. You should know what it is by now. So predation. Predation is when an organism eats another organism, like an owl eating a rat, or an eagle eating a bunny, a rabbit. And then competition is when organisms compete to get basic needs. So there are two: interspecific and intraspecific. So interspecific is between species, and intraspecific is between animals of the same species. Like for example, for plants, if in under a canopy, if they want to compete to get sunlight, that is intraspecific competition. But if two animals want to mate and they fight, then there is intraspecific. So yeah, I'm gonna mention this one again, because I don't know if I mentioned it properly. When the buffalo has lice on its body, it irritates the lice is a parasite. So the lice is a parasite, and then that's number one. There are a lot of interactions here that my teacher mentioned. So let me just see if I can find the question again. Oh, it's not there. But yeah, if I want to list all of the interactions that they have, number one is competition. The reason why is because there are a lot of lice on the body, and they are all competing for nutrients from the buffalo. Next one is going to be mutualism, because the myna and buffalo both gain benefits from each other. The third one will be parasitism, because the lice receives benefits, but the buffalo does not. So yeah, the myna and buffalo are mutualism, but the lice and the buffalo are parasitism. So I hope it's understandable. I think if you can also include predation, because the myna eats the lice. I think if I remember correctly, that's what teacher said. So yeah, if you don't get it, just go back and repeat what I and listen to what I said again. Okay, next is going to be about the mangrove ecosystem, because the mangrove is a bit unique with its components. So mangrove ecosystem is quite extreme, because number one, it is exposed to a lot of wind. Number two, its soil is very bad. It is muddy. It does not have enough air inside, so organisms don't really live inside these mangrove biomes. Number three is it is exposed to waves and water tides, because it's usually at the shore. Number four is seas usually go to the tidal area. Number five is there is a lot of light, because it's like literally near the shore. And number six is it is very salty, because again it came from the sea, and the sea has a lot of salt, right? So these are the biotic components. I think she didn't really mention this one much, so I'm gonna skip it. So what are the adaptations that the mangrove trees have? Number one will be the leaves. So the leaves, if you remember the halophyte stuff, it has thick cuticles and second stomata. Why you want thick cuticles and second stomata? To reduce the rate of transpiration, because there is a lot of light intensity there, so it's easy to lose water. So they make the stomata sunken, and then they also have thick cuticles to prevent that. And then because it is very salty, they need to excrete the salt through a different way. So they usually secrete this salt through, I think it's called guttation, where the salt will go out through the hydatod of the leaf. So I think it's here. The hydatod are here, and they secrete salt from the leaf through guttation. So yeah, and also the leaves are succulent. Succulent means juicy. So because they have a lot of juicy, they have a lot of inside they are very fleshy, very juicy. They can store a lot of water. Again, this is because it's very hot, so they want to keep as much water as possible. So yeah, and then because it's very salty, they want to remove it, so they use hydatots. And if it's too much salt, then they'll just kill the leaf. Okay, next will be pneumatophore roots. So pneumatophore roots are like these small roots. Like if you see a mangrove tree, it will have like some roots popping out here. So those are called pneumatophores. So pneumatophores are as we call them, short root projections, and they are used to breathe because it's very hard because there's no air in here. Usually in soil, roots need oxygen. So but then roots need oxygen, but then you can't really get oxygen in the soil because the soil is so muddy. There is no air inside the soil. So how do they get the air? The roots penetrate out of the soil. So this is to allow gaseous exchange between the submerged root and the atmosphere through what we call lenticels. Next will be prop roots. So prop roots and the other one is also buttress roots. So prop roots and buttress roots are special roots that will provide support to the tree to withstand certain winds, certain waves, certain disasters. But prop roots are sticking out of the ground, while buttress roots are more into the ground but bigger. And then of course they have seeds. But the seeds, viviparous seeds means they make young, I guess. But these seeds are weird because they don't need to have soil to germinate. They can grow water on the parent plant. So once the seeds are big enough, they will leave the plant through like wind, and then they'll already be partly grown. And the reason why you want the seeds to be partly grown is because you don't want them to be washed away by water. So when the seeds are partly grown, they can stick to the ground better, and they wouldn't be as easily washed away by the waves. Okay, next is colonization succession. So basically, mangrove trees aren't something that came like when the earth is born. It came slowly through a process. Back then when like there's no humans where the animals can freely like just take over the place. They slowly created their land bit by bit until they make a full mangrove system. So first of all, it starts with the pioneer species. So the pioneer species are like the first species to go on the land and use it. So and then they colonize it. After they colonize it, they breed. They make their own species there. They grow, and then slowly, when they don't like the soil anymore, they will move towards the front to colonize more soil. To create more soil. And then other species will evolve, will mutate, and then when they mutate, they evolve. They will adapt to the new environment, and then they will become a new species. So those are called successors. So what do I mean by it will make your own soil? So I'll talk about here coastal zone, middle zone, and inland zone. So remember that they have pneumatophores and they have a lot of these prop roots and buttress roots. Those are able to trap a lot of mud, and then eventually the mud will become harder and harder and harder, and then it will become soil, and it will become like more solid soil. And some of these trees prefer muddy soil, some of these trees prefer solid soil. So they will move. Slowly they will like move in front, and to make more soil, to make the soil muddier. So it's like back then it's only until here. And then they make here muddy, and then they don't like the soil anymore, so they continue going this way. Make here muddy, this becomes hard. Make here muddy, this becomes hard. Make here muddy, this becomes hard, harder, and eventually it will become actual land. So the first zone is the coastal zone. So the coastal zone is basically the area that is the muddiest. It is the most exposed to because it is the most exposed to the waves. And the main examples that teacher always talked about are Avicennia and Sonaratia. So Avicennia and Sonaratia are the ones that actually have pneumatophores. These are the only types of roots that have pneumatophores. And this helps the plant to trap mud, and then they can also trap other stuff. And then this mud slowly accumulates, and as I said, the mud hardens to become better soil, to become denser soil, to become harder soil. And then they don't like it anymore, so they move in front where they will make more soil muddy, where they will make more land, and then the Rhizopora species will take the next fund. Will take the land that they already solidified. And then that will be called the middle zone. So the middle zone will have prop roots, and then they will help block water from flowing to the land. And then again, it has roots that are so good at trapping mud. They will trap mud again, and the mud the mud will get harder and harder and harder. Will accumulate slowly over time. So now it's the riverbank. So the riverbank becomes higher and drier because less seawater overflows during high tides. So because there's no more water making the soil muddy, it will just eventually harden and harden and harden. So it becomes harder. And then again, the reservoir species doesn't like hard soil, so they want slightly muddy soil. So they will move in front, and then this area will be taken over by Briguera. And then so the Briguera will not be in the inland zone. So the inland zone are like further into the land, and it's harder for seawater to reach there, usually only during high tides. And Brigueras have buttress roots. Again, it helps to resist water, and it also helps to trap more soil, trap more mud. And this mud again will accumulate again and again, and it will sedimentation is basically when the mud accumulates and hardens. And then when I say seabed forms a new swamp, it means that this whole thing is a swamp now, because as I said, oh no, I went through the wrong place. As I said, let me just go back here first. So as I said earlier, back then, the sea was here. But now, because the Avicennia and Sonaratia grew here, and then they grow here, here becomes Rhizophora goes here, and then here becomes Briguera. So now this whole thing is a swamp. So, and then in the end, again, the soil gets harder and denser, and then the Briguera doesn't like it anymore, so they move in front after the others extend their land. And then land trees will grow instead, like the normal trees. So it's very important because it is a protection zone. As I said, it is a barrier for water, so it avoids flash floods and tsunamis. And it can also be a protection for animals. And next will be fishery resources, because a lot of fish are here. Not a lot of fish, but there are still fish and crabs. And then forestry resources, because their wood is very good for making furniture. And their wood can also be used to make charcoal. And lastly, food and medicine, because Avicennia fruit can be used as a vegetable. Its nut you can use its nut, or you can use its honey. And Sonaratia is for drinks and so on. Next is population ecology. So population ecology is it is a branch of ecology which studies the interactions of population with surroundings. So basically, how does the ecosystem work? How does the population work in an ecosystem? So there are multiple ways, or you can say, of how the population can be distributed. So what I mean by what this thing means is, how does the population spread? Is it uniform? Is it in one area where there's more water? Is it not there at all because it's too hard to live in there? So the factors that affect population distribution, number one will be for plants, you need a suitable amount of temperature, and this is because of the enzyme thing. You don't want your enzymes to denature, or you don't want your enzymes to not be fast enough, and you don't want your enzymes to slow down. Okay. Next will be water, and water is obvious for plants lah. You need photosynthesis ma. And if you have low water, the plant has to be very adaptive. Like for example, in deserts where there is less water, they need to have psychosomata, they need to have a needle-like leaves, they need to have thick cuticles and so on. And then for light, plants need light to make their own food. For pH of soil, as I said earlier, if the soil is too acidic or alkaline, the plant, you can say, will feel uncomfortable and it will not be able to function normally. And another factor will be some enzymes will not work properly if they are in acidic conditions. And then salt content. So the reason why is because osmosis works when based on what I understand, osmosis, water moves from a low water potential to a high water potential. What it means is, if there are a lot of salt here and there's only some salt here, then here has a high water potential because it has too much salt. So the water will go and make the salt less salty. But if your land has too much salt, the water will go out of the plant instead, and it will kill the plant because the plant will not get water. Okay, and then how about animals? Temperature, again, enzymes, and also it's too hot. That could be water because it needs to survive with water. Breeding site, is it safe? Food supply, is there enough food? Is there enough plants to survive in? That's why, like in deserts, you don't really see much survivors. You see like camels and a few like other stuff. There's not many animals in the desert because it's very hard to live there. And then there are three main patterns of population distribution. Number one is clump. Number two is random. Number three is uniform. This one is quite logical lah, so I won't say anything about it. Next is, how do you estimate the population size and the density? Size is how many organisms are there. Density is how many organisms per unit area are there. So what are the techniques that you can use to measure the population size and density? So number one, you use quadrat sampling, and number two, you use capture recapture. So for quadrat sampling, quadrat sampling is when you only use quadrat sampling when the organism that you're trying to count doesn't move that fast or doesn't move at all. Like for example, plants or very tiny snails, I guess. Things that do not move that fast or do not move at all, you can use quadrat sampling technique. So what you use is, you use a quadrat, and the quadrat can be divided into smaller quadrats, and you can use the frame to count how many organisms are there per each frame, per each quadrat. And then after that, you sum that all up all together, or you use the quadrats to find the size, density, and frequency. So yeah, again, also it depends on the type of size of organisms, the area of study, as well as the distribution and density of plants being studied. So yeah, you will need to use this quadrat method, knowing if your quadrat will be accurate or not. Like, is the plant everywhere, or is it only in the small area? So after you get the results from your quadrat sampling, you can estimate the frequency, the density, and the coverage of a plant species. So for frequency, it is what is the chance of you to get that organism in that quadrat. So the formula is to find how many quadrats are there with the species, divided by how many quadrats are there, and times 100%. Next will be density. So density is what is the average number of individuals per quadrat, or per unit area. So to find the density, you need to find how many species are there, divide by how many quadrats you use, times its area, because you want to find per unit area. So number of species divided by number of quadrats times area of quadrat. And then coverage percentage is how much of the soil is covered by the organism, or usually it's plant species. So like, how much of the soil is covered by a plant. So to find that, you need to find what is the area covered by the species, divided by what is the total area. So to find the total area, you need to find the number of quadrats times the area of each quadrat. And then because you want to find the percentage, you want to times it by 100%. The other method for moving organisms is called capture recapture, or capture recapture, or capture recapture, or capture mark release recapture. So how do you do capture mark release recapture? So the first thing you need to do is, you want to try and find a place to capture your organisms, and then So number one is you want to find a place to investigate, and then number two is you want to capture a certain amount of animals, and then you want to record them, and after that you mark them but you want to mark them with something that does not harm them and does not make them get caught easier. Like for example, you want to mark them using something like nail polish, paint, or normally it's Indian ink. So after you mark them, you let them back into the wild, wait a few days or wait a certain amount of time, and then capture another amount of organisms. Like maybe capture 20 first, and then you capture 20 again. And then you see how many did you mark, how many did you capture, number one, and number two, how many of them were marked. And then you use a formula to find the total amount. So it is number of first